He noticed something strange about himself every time life was about to change. Right before the new job, the new relationship, the big decision, the fresh start, his mind suddenly became dangerous, not supportive, not excited, dangerous. A simple choice would start feeling like a life-threatening mistake. Tiny risks would feel enormous, and out of nowhere, his brain would begin creating scenes of failure so vivid they felt real before anything had even happened. That's the disturbing part about the human mind. It doesn't wait for disaster to arrive. Sometimes, it creates fear first, just to stop you from changing at all. The human mind reacts strangely whenever life starts becoming unfamiliar. The moment someone gets close to a major decision, a new beginning or a different future, the brain often treats it like danger instead of opportunity, even if the change is healthy. Even if the current life is slowly exhausting them. That's why so many people remain stuck in situations they secretly hate. They stay in careers that drain them, keep entertaining people who constantly damage their peace, ignore opportunities they once desperately wanted, and sometimes ruin their own progress the moment things finally begin improving. Because to the brain, familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. Most people never notice this happening in real time. There's someone lying awake late at night, staring at the ceiling while his mind races through dozens of possible futures. Not because he enjoys overthinking, but because his brain is trying to protect him from pain before it arrives. He calls it being realistic. But slowly, realism becomes fear disguised as logic. Suddenly, he questions everything. Maybe he's not capable enough. Maybe people will judge him. Maybe he'll fail publicly. Maybe. This one decision could ruin everything, and the frightening part is that those thoughts feel believable. The brain is extremely good at creating emotional reactions to problems that don't even exist yet. A person can decide to improve their life and somehow feel more anxious afterward, which confuses them. They expect confidence to appear before action. They expect certainty before movement. But psychologically, growth usually works in reverse. The moment someone steps toward change, the mind begins searching for threats. Memories return, past embarrassment resurfaces, rejection from years ago suddenly feels relevant again. Moments that once made someone feel weak rise back into awareness like warnings. And most people mistake that fear for intuition. But fear before change doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it simply means the brain is leaving an emotional environment it became used to. Human beings grow attached to patterns, even painful ones. If someone spends years feeling anxious, ignored, uncertain, or emotionally exhausted, those feelings start becoming psychologically familiar. Not pleasant, just recognizable. And the brain prefers recognition over uncertainty. That's why someone can finally receive an opportunity they always wanted and still feel panic instead of excitement, because growth often requires abandoning an old identity. There's someone who keeps getting close to changing his life. He almost takes the risk. Almost starts over, almost becomes disciplined, almost speaks honestly, almost becomes the person he imagines in private. But every time the moment arrives, fear suddenly becomes louder. From the outside, people tell him to just do it, but they don't understand that his nervous system believes it's protecting him. The human brain evolved to prioritize survival, not happiness. Predictability feels safer than possibility. So whenever life starts changing, the mind creates worst-case scenarios as a defense mechanism. It believes fear can prevent future pain. That's why people procrastinate after getting opportunities, why they suddenly feel exhausted before important decisions, why they distract themselves right before moments that require courage. Sometimes the fear becomes physical. Someone spends 40 minutes staring at an email before replying, keeps walking around pretending to be busy instead of making an important phone call, sleeps later because tomorrow feels emotionally overwhelming before it even begins. And underneath all those behaviors is one hidden fear. What if this changes my entire life? Because the deepest fear usually isn't failure, it's transformation. People think they want change, but psychologically, change threatens identity. And identity controls more human behavior than most people realize. If someone secretly views himself as anxious, overlooked, unsuccessful, then becoming successful creates internal conflict. It sounds irrational, but the brain often resists realities that don't match its long-term self-image. That's why self-sabotage appears right before breakthroughs. Someone begins improving and suddenly loses. Consistency. Things start working and somehow chaos. Returns again. They receive attention and immediately withdraw from people, not because they enjoy suffering, but because the unfamiliar version of themselves feels emotionally unstable. The brain quietly asks, if I become this new person, who am I now? And fear tries pulling them back toward familiarity. There's another reason the mind creates fear before change. Big decisions force people to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty reminds human beings how little control they truly have. Most people spend their lives building routines that create the illusion of certainty. Same habits, same places, same emotional patterns. Then change arrives and destroys that illusion, and once uncertainty appears, the imagination becomes dangerous. A single decision suddenly branches into hundreds of imaginary disasters. The mind rehearses failure, humiliation, loneliness, regret. It creates emotional experiences from events that haven't even happened. Psychologists sometimes describe this as anticipatory anxiety, suffering, emotionally before reality confirms anything, which means someone can spend weeks fearing an outcome that never actually arrives. And strangely, the mind rarely imagines positive possibilities with the same intensity. People don't stay awake imagining how beautifully life could improve. They imagine losing everything. Instead, that negativity bias once helped humans survive. Ancient people benefited more from anticipating danger than opportunity. But in modern life, that same survival mechanism often becomes emotional. Imprisonment, especially for people who've been hurt before, there's someone who learned early that hope can become painful. So, now whenever life starts improving, his brain immediately searches for hidden danger. Good news feels suspicious. Opportunities create anxiety. Happiness feels temporary before it even fully arrives. Without realizing it, he lives in constant emotional self-protection. And eventually, fear starts shaping behavior in quiet ways. He delays important decisions, avoids emotional commitment, pretends not to care about goals that secretly matter deeply to him, uses humor whenever. Conversations become too personal, acts emotionally detached because vulnerability feels unsafe. Over time, some people become so used to psychological defense mechanisms that they mistake them for personality traits. This is just who I am. But often, it's simply who they had to become in order to protect themselves. The human mind adapts quickly. If fear once prevented emotional pain, the brain remembers that strategy. If avoidance reduced disappointment, it repeats the behavior. If staying small protected someone from criticism, growth itself starts feeling threatening. That's why fear before change feels personal. The brain genuinely believes it's helping, but protection can slowly become a prison. And one of the saddest things is how many people abandon better versions of themselves because they mistake fear for a warning sign. Instead of a transition period, they think confidence should feel peaceful. But real growth often feels uncomfortable first. Someone starts setting boundaries and suddenly feels selfish, starts healing and feels emotionally exposed, starts chasing ambition and feels guilty for wanting more, starts becoming honest and suddenly fears rejection. The old identity fights to survive because every transformation involves loss. Even positive change requires leaving behind parts of the old self. Old habits, old coping mechanisms, old emotional patterns that once provided safety. And naturally, the brain resists that loss. Before almost every meaningful life change, there's a quiet internal battle. Part of someone wants to move forward. Another part desperately wants to stay, where things feel familiar. That conflict is deeply human. People imagine courage as the absence of fear. But psychologically, courage is usually the decision to continue while fear is still present. Because fear may never disappear completely, the mind may still whisper that something will go wrong. That people will judge him, that failure will be humiliating, that staying the same would simply be easier. And honestly, staying the same often is easier temporarily, but eventually people suffer from avoidance in quieter ways. Not always through dramatic failure, sometimes through regret, the kind that appears years later when someone realizes they spent more energy avoiding discomfort than building the life they truly wanted. Maybe that's why the mind creates fear before every major change. Because transformation asks a terrifying question. Are you willing to let go of the person you once needed to be In order to become the person you're capable of becoming, most people don't answer immediately. They hesitate, delay, overthink, doubt themselves repeatedly. But eventually, some people reach a point where remaining the same becomes more painful than stepping into the unknown, and that's usually when life finally changes. Not when fear disappears, not when certainty suddenly arrives. But when someone quietly decides that unfamiliar growth is less painful than familiar suffering, and maybe that's the truth most people never realize, the mind creates fear before every big change because it's trying to protect the current version of you. But sometimes, the current version is exactly what needs to be left behind.